Michael's laugh cut the gala like a blade. "Who here can speak 9 languages?" he asked, smiling as if it were only a game. Daniel, uniform folded over his arm, felt the room shrink to the beat of his heart. In his pocket, a paper whispered, "Speak 9 and you will not be ignored." Someone slid another note across the table. "Come to the mezzanine at midnight." Grace's message blinked on his phone. "Don't be late." And for the first time, Daniel feared what being heard might cost. What happened next shocked everyone and set off a chain of events no one saw coming. Stay with me, this is a story you need to hear. Before we start the story, comment below and let us know where in the world you're watching from today. And if you find this story impactful, don't forget to subscribe for more. The night smelled of lemon disinfectant and old paper, a smell Daniel had learned to love and resent at the same time. The high-rise office was empty except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant hiss of traffic, like a tired sea. Fluorescent lights flickered in the lobby, throwing long, thin shadows that moved like slow fish across the marble floor. Daniel stood by the elevator, the white cloth of his mother's uniform folded over his arm, and listened to the building breathe. He was small for a man who wanted to be taken seriously. His hands still showed the faint calluses of repeated scrubbing, and his shirt still carried the faint, warm scent of his mother's perfume, Grace's jasmine, because he kept the uniform close when he slept. There was a private ritual to his nights. After the floors were waxed and the coffee machines were wiped clean, he would stand alone and speak. Not for anyone, not for pay, for practice. "Salam," he said under his breath, then softer, "Bonjour," then "Hola," then a string of syllables that rolled through Mandarin and Russian, and a language that belonged to the mountains of his grandmother's old country. He listened to the words curl and fall into the empty air. Sometimes the foreignness settled around him like a cloak. Sometimes it felt like a small, warm lamp he carried in his chest. The voice in him was stubborn. It had learned its stubbornness from Grace. She had come to this city with 2 suitcases and a dozen promises in her pocket. She had named him Daniel because she liked the way the name sounded, firm, gentle, and because the Bible stories her mother told in the old house had stuck in her like seeds. Daniel had grown up on tales about men who spoke truth to power. He had also grown up on nights like this, where truth was measured in coins and a landlord's patience. From the elevator mirror, he caught his own face, a boy's jaw with an adult's tiredness, wide-set eyes that made jokes and judged things too quickly. He had learned to read faces, the bored, the hungry, the dishonest, like books with missing pages. That talent had come with a curse. People assumed he was like the uniform he sometimes wore, cleaning, quiet, invisible. They did not know he could ask for directions in 9 languages or translate a contract at 20 paces. He folded the uniform carefully. Grace had taught him to fold as if the fabric could earn them a better day. "Leave it neat," she would say. "The world is cruel, but it respects neat hands." There was humor in her voice even when her feet ached from standing. There was sorrow too, the kind that lined itself into the slow curves of her smile. Tonight, the building smelled of lemon and old paper, but there was another smell that pressed at the edges of the night. Money, faint, metallic, like coins hidden in a drawer. A locked office on the top floor glowed with papered lights. The city around them congratulated itself in neon. Somewhere uptown, a limo sighed and stopped. Daniel wondered what it would be like to be invited into one of those rooms, to be asked to stay and sit, not to scrub. He wasn't naive. He had seen the way men in suits laughed quietly at the idea of him. He had felt it once in the eyes of a man who called himself a collector of talent, and then laughed when Daniel answered a simple question in Arabic. That laugh had been like a slap that left no mark but taught a lesson. Words could be weaponized, and sometimes speaking them was a dare, which is why tonight's small, strange discovery felt like a door. He found the paper in the 3rd floor stairwell, tucked between the pages of a discarded magazine. It was not much, an envelope slightly damp at one edge, and a single line of neat handwriting inside. Speak 9, and you will not be ignored. The line made no promise. It only suggested a possibility. Whoever had written it had taken care with the ink, as if the sentence were heavy and needed to be balanced. Daniel turned the paper over in his hands until the words blurred. He thought of Grace folding laundry in the bedsit they called home, of her hands moving like music. He thought of his childhood, languages arriving at the dinner table like guests, harrowing and kind. He had learned English from television, Spanish from a neighbor, Arabic from a street vendor who loved to bargain, Russian from a second-hand book with a cracked spine. He could not remember in what order the languages had come. They had layered themselves in him like thin coats of paint. An impartial voice might have said, "This is a tired young man, barely scraping into respectability, clutching at a superstition." But Daniel had learned to listen to voices differently. The empathetic voice inside him, warm and quick, said, "This is an invitation." It said, "Your mother's neat hands and your long nights mean something." It said, "Perhaps laughter is only a test of the weight of your words." He slid the paper into his pocket and walked to the top floor. The carpet swallowed his footsteps. The penthouse lights were low, and somewhere within them a piano sang faintly. He watched the city beyond the windows, cars like burned-out stars, the river making silver where it moved. The panoramic view made him feel both very small and strangely whole, the way a person can be when they stand on the edge of something and do not yet know whether to step forward. His phone buzzed. A message from Grace. "Don't stay too late. Sleep when you can. Love, G." He thumbed a reply and breathed in the smell of lemon. He thought of the medicated smell in his mother's knuckles, of the years she had spent making beds for strangers who never learned her name. He thought of the hidden languages that had made him useful and invisible at once. There was a knock on a nearby door, a polite knock. Daniel flattened his hand against the cool glass and watched a figure move across a distant room. He imagined a man in a crisp robe, someone who smelled of oud and spoke in a voice that ordered the world around him. He thought of laughter, how quickly it could curl into scorn, and how often the wealthy misunderstood kindness for weakness. He had one small thing, the paper in his pocket and the steadiness in his throat. He had learned the humility of waiting, but he had also learned the hunger of refusing to be small. If the night had given him a choice, stay invisible or take a step, he felt the step scraping at his heels, restless and patient. The building's clock chimed softly. Outside, someone set off fireworks in the distance, their colors blooming for a moment over the dark water. Daniel closed his eyes and let the shapes of the languages roll through him like distant thunder. He thought of a line tucked safely in his pocket, the one whispered by someone who might have been kind or cruel, helpful or mocking. "Speak 9, and you will not be ignored." He smiled, half to himself, and began to rehearse again, not for anyone, but because the practice had become a prayer. The gala smelled different from the offices, roses and strong coffee, a perfume that did not belong to anyone who cleaned for a living. Crystal glasses chimed like small bells. Men in dark suits moved like slow predators. Women in silk laughed like a string of wind chimes. Daniel had worked 1,000 nights like this, a quiet shadow between the tables, wiping crumbs, replacing napkins, folding the last of the linen. Tonight, the chandeliers made the marble floor look like a river of light. He felt, as he always did in places like this, both invisible and painfully present. He was on his knees beneath a long table when he heard the laughter, that low, easy laugh that belonged to the kind of man who never expects to be surprised. It came from the far end of the room, where a small circle held their own world. A tall man with an amber robe, a gold watch, and an air that suggested he paid for silence. Around him moved people who looked important only because they stood close to him. He was introduced like a weather report. Mr. Michael Grant, an Arab-born investor whose name had floated through the city in headlines and rumors. The impartial voice would say, "This is a routine night. The rich enjoy their rich amusements. A man laughs, another cleans." That is the way of things. The empathetic voice said. Daniel heard the laugh and felt a small, hard stone of anger. Not at the man, exactly, anger at the years it had taken to make his voice a toy for people to test. The laugh reminded him of the collector, who once called him a novelty for speaking a market vendor's Arabic. It reminded him of Grace folding clothes in the kitchen at dawn, pretending not to notice the ache in her hands. The laugh nudged something awake. Daniel finished tucking the napkins and rose, wiping his palms on his trousers. He was careful, always careful. He kept the uniform scent of lemon, the practice of languages in the small pocket of his mind. As he straightened, a small handkerchief slid from beneath a chair and brushed a shoe. It was embroidered in a language he half recognized, the script curling like tiny waves. Attached was a thin card, the handwriting neat. Come to the mezzanine at midnight. Speak. The card did not say who had sent it. The card should have been ignored. A cautious man would have folded the handkerchief into a corner and left it to the lost things of the night. But Daniel had a paper in his pocket already. Another strange note he had found days before, and the words on that paper still hummed under his skin. Speak 9, and you will not be ignored. The new card felt like a key dropped into his hand by chance. He stuffed the handkerchief into his pocket and moved through the crowd, a broom in his right hand and a quiet in his chest. The mezzanine was a place where people looked away fast, as if a glance might catch their private lives and steal them. He waited near a ficus lamp and watched the party move. At 10 to midnight, a man seated at the head table rose and called for quiet. He raised his glass. He named Michael Grant and praised him for his generous support to the new Cultural Exchange Foundation. The applause washed over the room. Money clapped for money. When the applause dwindled, Michael's eyes scanned the perimeter, and then, impossibly, he looked straight at Daniel. For a moment the room, and its music, and its lacquered faces shrank. Daniel felt the old, familiar weight of being seen as an oddity. Michael smiled in a way that was not unkind. We have a small entertainment for tonight, he said, his voice like velvet over steel. A test. A game. Whoever can speak 9 languages in 5 minutes we will reward rare skills. A few people laughed, half in jest. The impartial voice would note, a rich man looking for amusement, and the room obliges. The empathetic voice said, the smile was a net. It made something taut inside Daniel, his chest, his memory. He thought of the card burning in his pocket, like a secret. A manager, a man named Peter who had watched Daniel for a year with an expression Daniel could never place, approached him as if by accident. Peter's face was tidy and soft, and his eyes were the color of office glass. You speak more than one language, Peter said flatly, like a man naming an office supply. Daniel blinked. He thought of the handkerchief and the card and the paper in his pocket. He thought of Grace's thumb pressing a patch of fabric when she sewed. Yes, Daniel said. His voice was small. It had layers now, English with a soft accent, Spanish he had learned from a child who lived next door, Arabic that rolled against his teeth like a drum, a little French, some Russian. He could feel the words prickle at the back of his throat. Peter smiled in a way that did not reach his eyes. Mr. Grant finds these things amusing, he said. Would you come up? He would like to speak with you. Daniel swallowed. There were many ways to interpret Peter's invitation. A man with a tidy face had many reasons to step forward. He could be helpful. He could be cruel. The room smelled of sugar and perfume and the soft, metallic tang of wine. Grace's text buzzed in his pocket. Don't be late. Come home safe. Love, G. He wrote back an arrow of a smile and the word, okay. On the mezzanine, the light was cooler and shadows were long. Michael sat with 2 men we did not know and a woman who watched like a hawk. He asked the usual questions, a practiced curiosity, but there was a tone under them, a hunger of being surprised that made his voice sharp. He seemed to expect spectacle. He wanted to be entertained. Tell me, Michael said to Daniel after a small, thoughtful pause, was the most dangerous language. The empathetic voice thought, a strange question. It was not about geography or grammar. It was about power. Daniel remembered being asked once by a man who had smiled like Michael and then handed him a coin as if pity were currency. That coin had stung. This question felt like a bridge to the old sting. The one people think they know, Daniel answered quietly. Because when they think they know, they stop listening. A ripple of polite amusement moved through the group. It landed on Michael like a light. He laughed then, the same laugh Daniel had heard before. Clever answer, he said, and the group smiled. Then Michael leaned forward and plucked a single, elegant card from a silver dish. There was a sentence on it, printed in a language Daniel recognized as Farsi, though he had not practiced it in years. Michael handed the card to Daniel. Translate, Michael said. Daniel's mouth felt dry. He read the sentence. 3 lines of calligraphy that spoke of a family letter and a debt to be settled. He felt the words call like birds migrating, familiar but distant. He translated them slowly, not because he doubted himself, but because he wanted the sound of his voice to be careful. When he finished, the room was quiet enough to hear his breath. There was a pause, the kind of pause that rearranges things. Michael's eyes narrowed in the way of a surgeon. Very good, he said at last, and reached into his coat. He pulled out a small envelope and placed it on the table between them. We do not often see true skill, he said. There is a reward for skill. Peter was watching with the polite fever of someone who measures people for usefulness. Michael's hand lingered near the envelope, and Peter's hand, unseen by most, slid a second piece of paper toward him. No one else noticed. Daniel felt a cold, uneasy flutter in his chest, like a moth caught under glass. He did not know why. He only knew he had learned to notice small movements. The impartial voice would say, a rich man offers a prize. A manager slips a note. The world proceeds. The empathetic voice said, the note was a shadow. It suggested someone was making the moment into a small stage, and stages always need someone to set the props. Daniel accepted the envelope with hands that trembled only slightly. Inside was an address and a time. It was not a wage. It was an invitation. Come tomorrow. We have work that needs language, Michael said, as if promising dawn. Daniel kept his expression even. He had been invisible as long as he liked, and he had been noticed as long as he did not like. Now the city had offered him something both bright and dangerous. He left the mezzanine with the envelope burning in his pocket and the handkerchief tucked with the papers he already carried. Outside, the night had cooled, and the river breathed like an animal asleep. He dialed Grace and heard her voice, thin and tender, and he told her, simply, that he would be late. She did not ask where. That silence held its own language. As he walked home past parked cars and the faint glow of late-night shops, Daniel kept thinking of the small moments, a laugh, a slide note, a handkerchief, and how they could be collected like coins until they weighed a life down. He told himself that he would be careful. He told himself he would take the job only to translate, only to study. He told himself that the world sometimes offered doors with both hands. Somewhere under the street lamps, Peter's smile looked different in Daniel's memory. Helpful, yes, but also like someone who knew how to point a man toward a stage and then move the ropes. The thought lodged like a stone. The inciting event had arrived not as thunder, but as a polished bell. It had made a single, clean sound that promised both chance and the risk of being used. Daniel walked home under the thin light, the card, the envelope, and the half-remembered line in his pocket, all humming like small truths. He did not know the shape of what was coming. He only knew the silence at his back felt suddenly full of feet. The first morning after the gala felt thin, as if the city had breathed in and forgotten to exhale. Daniel woke with the envelope heavy in his pocket like a small, private stone. He did not open it until he had packed Grace's lunch and folded her uniform the way she liked, corners tight, edges neat. Grace watched him from the doorway, her face as calm as a photograph. "Be careful," she said, and Daniel heard more than the words. He heard the years that had made her careful, nights of cleaning, mornings of quiet bills paid, the way she always counted things twice. The world likes to pretend it is kind. He kissed her forehead, and the jasmine scent rose for a moment like a memory. "I will be careful," he promised. The promise felt thin too, but it was the best armor he had. When he arrived at the office that Michael had named in the envelope, the building looked softer in daylight, its glass less like judgment and more like skin. The receptionist, Anna, met him in the lobby. She wore a name tag and an ease that suggested she belonged in the room. Her smile was quick and sincere. There was nothing to mark her as dangerous. The impartial voice would say, Anna was the assistant. She was efficient and warm. The empathic voice noticed the way her fingers trembled when she poured coffee, the small habit of twisting a ring on her finger when she lied. Small things, like paper cuts, reveal where a person has been. "Mr. Grant will see you in the library," Anna said, and led him through corridors that smelled faintly of leather and old books. The library was lined with volumes whose spines had eaten light for years. Michael sat at the far end like a king at a long table. His robe was soft. His eyes were sharp. Beside him, Peter stood like a shadow that had forgotten it belonged to a man. "You did well last night," Michael said without ceremony. "You have a rare gift." Daniel felt the compliment like both warmth and weight. "Thank you," he said. Michael explained the work in careful sentences. Translations for a cultural exchange program, private readings, negotiations with investors from many countries. "We need someone who can make the world listen," he said. "We need you." Daniel listened. The job sounded like a ladder built of paper, fragile but useful. Michael's offer was generous. He spoke of travel, of rooms where people leaned forward to hear a single word, of money that did not fit in wallets, but slipped into envelopes like butter. Daniel thought of Grace's feet and the way she hummed when she sewed. He thought of the small kindnesses that added up to survival. When Michael's offer came, Anna watched Daniel as if she were reading a pitch and the man both. "I can help," she said suddenly. "I can teach you how they like their words, not just what they mean, but how they feel to a listener." The empathic voice heard eagerness in Anna's words and a hunger that resembled Daniel's own. The impartial voice noted, two people with useful talents had brushed shoulders, and the world had decided to test whether they would be friends or tools. Over the next few days, Daniel found himself in a strange apprenticeship. He would sit beside Anna in small, velvet rooms while Michael and his guests discussed art deals and charity initiatives. Anna taught him soft tones, when to pause for effect, and how to turn a literal translation into a living sentence. She revealed an unexpected tenderness for language, an almost parental care in the way she corrected an awkward consonant. Daniel admired her skill and the honest way her eyes lit when he learned. At night, when he returned home with his pockets warmer than usual, he would tell Grace simple things about a new word he had learned, about the joke Michael had made, about the way Anna had taught him to drop his voice and lift the last syllable of a plea. Grace listened with the same calm that had steadied him all his life. But one evening, as Daniel described a negotiation that had turned suddenly sharp, Grace's hand tightened on the dishcloth. "Do not let them turn your gift into a show," she said. "People will clap when you sing for them, and then they will go home. You will be left with applause that means nothing." Daniel loved her for saying it, but he felt a small restlessness. The work filled a hunger he had only half named, an ache for recognition that was not pity. He liked being useful in rooms where words could cost more than the hours he spent polishing tables. Yet he feared what Grace feared, that usefulness could be a chain. Meanwhile, Peter's appearances grew more frequent and less friendly. He began to ask small, officious questions about Daniel's background, where his family was from, how he learned French, whether he had legal papers to travel. Daniel answered each with the truth he felt safe offering. Peter's face remained polite, but more calculating by the day. One afternoon, Daniel overheard a conversation he was not meant to hear. He paused outside an open door and listened as Peter spoke to Michael in voices low as coals. "He's good," Peter said, "but he's also vulnerable. People like him take what they can get." Michael hummed in agreement. "We must be careful with what we promise," he replied. "We have use for his face and for his languages, but we must ensure loyalty." The empathic voice screamed the word loyalty like an alarm. Loyalty was the kind of thing bought and bartered, not born. Daniel's stomach tightened. He imagined Grace's hands and the clean corners of the world she tried to keep for them. He tried to imagine what loyalty would cost him and whether any price would leave him whole. A small twist arrived with a cup of coffee and a message. Anna handed him a note between files, a short line written in a familiar slanted hand. It was not Michael's. It read, "Be careful of kindness that asks for names." Anna's eyes met his, quick and honest. For a moment she seemed older, burdened by knowledge. "Who sent this?" Daniel asked softly. Anna shrugged, the ring on her finger catching the light. "Someone who doesn't like being lied to," she said. Her smile was painful, the kind that tries to make hard things softer. "I know about the charity program. I know enough to be uneasy. I thought you should know." The note was not a map, but a mirror. It reflected fears Daniel had learned to hide. That people who loved language could be used as tools of convenience by those who had more than words. He turned the paper over in his hands and saw a faint watermark, an emblem of Michael's foundation. The twist, it was small but sharp, suggested that even the warnings came from within the walls he had entered. That night, Daniel lay awake listening to the city's pulse. The empathic voice in him whispered, "Trust the hand that gives your name back to you." The impartial voice observed, "In rooms where power and language meet, there are always margins where truth gets cut away." Daniel found himself pulled between gratitude and suspicion, between the glow of new bills in his pocket and the memory of Michael's laugh. He wanted to believe in Anna's warmth and Michael's generosity and Peter's steady face. He wanted to believe he could step into the light without losing the certainty of his mother's neat hands. But under the lamp, the envelope in his pocket felt like a riddle. The small sentence he had kept folded in his wallet, the one that had come before everything, still hummed. "Speak 9, and you will not be ignored." He had not yet decided whether that was an invitation to freedom or a trap where speech becomes currency. The next morning, Peter asked Daniel to confirm his availability for an upcoming private meeting. Daniel agreed, with a voice that tried to sound calm. He had learned that sometimes courage was simply the measure of the next step forward. Yet as he left, Anna touched his arm, a brief, steadying press. "Be careful," she said. The words like a small pledge between two people who had only just begun to trust one another. Daniel nodded. In the hallway, a framed photograph of Michael with a foreign minister smiled down like a prophecy. Daniel carried the photo's brightness with him, and the warning tucked close to his chest. He walked toward the next meeting, not yet knowing which of his companions would be friends, and which would turn to shadow. The morning the twist came, the city smelled of rain and hot tar, as if the sky had washed itself and left the streets sticky with decision. Daniel was careful with his steps, careful with the envelope in his pocket. He had begun to catalog the small signs that made a life feel tidy, which people smiled without teeth, which hands trembled when they lied, which rooms smelled like old paper and empty promises. He thought he knew the map of this new world. He did not expect the map to redraw itself in a single hour. Michael had asked for a later meeting. The library was quieter than before. The afternoon light fell in slow bars between the books. Michael sat behind the same long table, his robe folding a small darkness into his lap. Peter stood off to the side, face like polished glass. Anna showed Daniel into the room with the same quick, efficient smile he had come to trust. Her fingers were steady as she handed him a thin stack of papers wrapped in a red ribbon. "These are translations for a negotiation," she said, voice low. 2 documents, a family letter, and a land registry statement. They need exactness, Daniel. No liberties. Michael wants you to read them aloud during the meeting. Her eyes were soft, and there was that small tremor in her hands when she poured coffee, something Daniel had noticed and memorized like a phone number. He took the papers, feeling the weight of the ribbon like an added promise. The empathetic voice said, Anna looked like a friend, like a teacher, like the kind of person who would hand you a ladder that does not wobble. The impartial voice said, someone who works that close to power will sometimes have to bend. Daniel opened the first letter. It was a private thing, a faded script speaking of debts and forgiveness, names that moved like ghosts. He translated with care, shaping the sentences so they would land easily for listeners who did not share the language. Anna sat beside him, watching each word as if it were a bead on a necklace. He finished the letter and then began the land registry statement. That document was different. The script was official, stamped with seals that smelled faintly of wax and old ink. It spoke of property boundaries and inheritances and an old family's claim over a valley in a country Daniel's grandmother used to speak of at the dinner table. There was a name on one line, one he knew in the way you know the corner of a familiar street. It was not his family's name, but the name belonged to people who had once lived where his family had been born. His mouth tightened. As he read, the words fell into the air, dull, legal, final. They described a transfer of land, made to a foreign holding company, dated years earlier. Daniel's throat went dry. He kept translating because his hands had learned to do the work of another person's needs. He felt the room tilt a fraction. When he finished, Michael smiled, and his smile felt like a closing hinge. He stood and thanked Daniel with a small gesture that put the papers back into a leather folder. Perfect, Michael said. You were precise. We will file these with the panel tomorrow. Daniel left the library with a taste of metal in his mouth. The words from the registry had lodged inside him like a splinter. He walked the long way home, past cafes where people argued softly about the weather and nations, past a small fruit stall where the vendor called out like he was trying to catch the sun. He folded the events of the day into his mind like clothes, trying to make them neat. That evening, he returned home to find Grace at the sink, humming as she rinsed a plate. Her hands moved with their careful rhythm. Daniel placed his bag down and reached for the kettle, but his fingers fumbled. He told her lightly about a registry and a letter he had translated, watching for the shape of any news in her face. Grace's song stopped. She set the plate down slowly. What registry? She asked. Daniel blinked. Just an old document, he said. A transfer, land, family name. Her face shifted, something older than worry crossing it. She dried her hands and sat at the small table. Tell me everything, she said. He did. He told her the stamp, the name, names he had heard in stories, and the date that made the paper look like a trap already sprung. Grace listened without interrupting. When he finished, she folded her fingers in her lap and spoke like a woman who had been keeping a history in her head for years. That valley, she said quietly. My sister, your Aunt Mary, used to send letters from there when we were children. They had a small house near the stream. They said the government came and took records. We thought it was lost in the war. Daniel felt something small drop between his ribs. Do you think this is connected? Grace shook her head once, a hard, quick motion. I do not know. Her mouth set. But be careful, Daniel. The world tightened. Daniel wanted to go back to Michael, to ask questions with the blunt force of a man demanding answers. Instead, he slept badly and woke to a news alert he should not have seen. The headline was short and clinical. Local families evicted after registration review. The story below, it showed photographs, satellite views of a valley, trucks on a road, scattered bundles of people near the market. A name floated in the article, the same holding company Michael's organization had mentioned. A line in the report said a foreign investor had legally purchased the deed years ago after a review. The local council had upheld it. An eviction order had been signed. Daniel's hands went cold. He reread the piece, looking for a single line that might stand for error. The legalese was tight. The language of the document he had translated, his translation, matched the phrasing quoted in the council report. He walked back to the building where Michael's library lived and did something he had not done before. He asked to see Anna. She met him in the corridor with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Everything all right?" she asked. Daniel did not waste breath. He pushed the council's article into her hands. She scanned the words quickly, and something like a small war passed over her face. Shock, then a quick calculation, then resignation. She did not look surprised. She looked burdened. "Anna," Daniel said. "Did you know? Was I used?" Anna's mouth formed a thin line. For a moment she looked like someone who had been afraid for a long time. She pulled the ring from her finger and pressed it into her palm like a talisman. "I told you to be careful," she said finally. "But I did not tell you everything because it would have protected me less than it would have freed me." Daniel stared. Words piled in him like fallen fruit. "What do you mean?" Anna sat on a bench, fingers trembling. "Michael's foundation does more than fund galleries and scholarships," she said. "They buy legal claims, yes. They use translation to make documents acceptable in courts where the language is required. Sometimes the documents are real. Sometimes they are made to look real. They do not always ask the translator to check for ethics. They ask for clarity." Her voice was small. Daniel felt the world tilt again. He thought of the handkerchief in his pocket, the cards slid under chairs, the voice that had said "Speak 9, and you will not be ignored." "You knew," he said. "You worked with him. You." Anna flinched. "I warned you because I wanted you to be careful in the business, not because I could stop it," she whispered. "I have a family. I take orders. If I refuse, they will take more than my job. It is not an excuse. It is true." Betrayal landed with the coldness of rain on a hot day. Daniel had been careful about cynics and kindness. He had not been prepared for a friend to be a cell in the machine. He wanted to throw the paper at her, to shake her until she told him everything. Instead, he sat down beside her, because his chest felt like it might break if he stood. "So you helped them," he said. "You brought me here." Anna's face crumpled, and for the first time since he had met her, she did not try to hide her fear. "I thought I could steer what I could," she said. "I thought if I put someone honest in the room, it would change things. I told you to watch names because I hoped you would refuse the wrong ones. It was cowardice and hope tangled together. I am sorry." The empathic voice inside Daniel was a blade, sharp and precise. He could see her fear and know the world that had pressed it onto her. The impartial voice noted she had betrayed trust. She had also admitted coercion. The two truths sat beside each other like strangers in one bed. Daniel left her with the taste of metal and the news article folded in his hand. The betrayal burned, but beneath the burn lay a new, darker thing. His language, his gift, had been used to seal a wound in a place he loved. The papers he had translated had been the bridge that made a legal lie into something the world would accept. That night, he stood at the window and watched the city lights blink like small accusations. He thought of Michael's smile, neat as a razor. He thought of Peter's glass face. He thought of Anna's ring, warm in his palm when she let it go. The first twist had not only changed what Daniel knew, it had remade the shape of the path ahead. The world had stopped being a ladder of chance and became a field of traps where his own voice could be used against people he loved. He folded the news article and tucked it like a live coal into his pocket. He would have to decide now whether to keep speaking for others or to learn how to use his words as a shield. Rain began again that week, small and steady, washing dust into the gutters and making the city smell like wet stone. Daniel watched it from the kitchen window while Grace hummed at the sink, her hands moving with the same slow patience that had steadied him since childhood. The kettle sang. Outside, the street lamps blurred into soft gold. Inside, His world felt thin as paper and twice as easy to tear. He kept replaying Anna's apology in his head, her ring warm in his palm, her voice small. The thought that someone he trusted had slid his talent into a machine of dispossession made his stomach a tight fist. He wanted to shout, to go back to Michael's library and throw the papers into the fireplace. Instead, he brewed coffee and watched the steam lift like a promise he did not trust. There were practical problems that made emotion into action. Peter began to ask for more documentation. "We need you to sign a form for travel," Peter said one morning, sliding a neat stack across Michael's mahogany desk. The paper smelled faintly of cedar and officialness. Work visa. Short trip. A translator should travel with the delegation. Daniel read the form. Small, legal words leapt like fish across the page. There was a clause that would allow him to represent Michael's foundation formally, to translate on their behalf. There was a line he could not read, written in legalese, that Anna translated with a soft, clinical voice. It would grant them rights to use his translations and recordings. The impartial voice would note, this was a routine business step. The empathetic voice heard the caveat ringing like a bell. Once you lend your voice, it can be recorded, altered, and used where you cannot reach it. He hesitated. Grace watched him fill the kettle without speaking. "If you go," she said finally, "remember why you learned those languages." Her hands were dry from washing, her face quiet as a stone altar. "You taught them to speak for truth, not to dress power's lies in prettier words." Her words were a hand on his shoulder, steady and warm. Yet another part of him, the part that had begun to register warmth in Michael's praise and felt lighter with each envelope, tugged the other way. The money they were offering would cover months of bills. It would ease Grace's back and let him breathe without counting coins. He could imagine a life where he wasn't always pruning edges. He could imagine showing Grace a small apartment with a window that opened onto trees. The city offered reasons to be practical. On a wet afternoon, Daniel found a note on his doorstep. No address, no signature, just a line in Farsi he could not place at first. When he translated it, the word stung. Keep translating, and your family will be translated out of a home. The handwriting was shaky, the paper cheap. The threat was precise. He took the note to Anna. She looked at it for a long moment, her face closed like a book. "You should not show this to Michael," she said. "He will use it to test your loyalty." Her hands trembled in a way that was not cold. "But you should not ignore it either." That night, someone rang their bell at 2 a.m. Daniel jolted awake, heart thudding like a drum. He pressed his ear to the door and heard muffled voices speaking in a language he recognized, Farsi, and a dialect he had only heard from his grandmother's lips. Fear moved through him like ice. He opened the door a crack. A thin man in a soaked coat looked up at him, eyes wide and tired, and whispered a name Daniel knew from a story. Mary. He said something about broken deeds and a man in a robe. The man handed Daniel a folded photograph, an old house by a stream, a woman with Grace's likeness laughing in sunlight. The thin man left before Daniel could ask more. The photograph burned in Daniel's hand like an accusation. He could feel the valley's dust in the picture, the shape of a roof his grandmother had described. The man outside had looked at Daniel with something like pleading. The impartial voice would say, "Strangers come with grievances to translators because words can change outcomes." The empathetic voice felt the plea as a small, urgent drumbeat. This is no longer only paper and law. People he did not know had already been hurt by the seams he had stitched. Pressure multiplied. At Michael's office the next day, Peter's question sharpened. "We need to be sure you're loyal," he said, his voice flat as paper. "We run background checks. We ask about family. We verify you've no ties that could complicate negotiations abroad." He held out a file with Daniel's name on it. Inside, among neat printouts, were notes and photos, some that Daniel recognized from his own childhood, some labeled with dates and a foreign city he had never visited. How did you get those? Daniel asked, throat tight. Peter's gaze was calm and unreadable. Information travels, he said. You must understand. When people work at our level, everyone is exposed. It's not personal. It's just the way deals are done. Daniel saw then how easily his life could be rearranged by facts someone else collected. A photograph here, a registry there, a recorded sentence spoken in a room with lacquered wood and an audience. His gift for language had become a ledger item, and ledgers could be traded. Anna tried to help in the only way she knew how. She slipped him a thumb drive, small and cold, and said, "Record everything on the drive. If anything happens to you, this will be proof of who said what." Her voice broke. "I can't risk it on paper. They erase paper. They can't change what is on tape unless they have the tape." It was a small, dangerous rebellion. Daniel hid the drive where his mother kept old photographs. He imagined that if the worst came, if his voice was twisted into a weapon against the poor, he could play back the truth. Even as he acted, his doubts shredded him. He began to test himself in the quiet moments, reading aloud into his phone, saying phrases and languages he barely remembered, listening to his voice replayed with the rawness of proof. The sound of himself speaking felt both intimate and estranged, like seeing one's reflection in a window you cannot touch. Grace noticed the change. She sat across from him one evening, fingers folded, and said, "If they ask you to betray someone, will you do it for money?" Her question was simple as a dishcloth. Daniel hesitated. The empathetic voice in him tightened. Betrayal is like a slow leak. You do not notice until you sink. The impartial voice observed. People make choices when the world narrows. He thought of the trucks in the photograph and the thin man who had come in the rain, and he heard in his mind the evicted families' small cries he had read in the paper. "I don't know," he admitted. The words tasted like copper. "I will try not to. I will try to use the work to help. But if they ask something I cannot do, if they ask me to lie," he did not finish. He could not know what he would do, only that the choice would hurt. That same week Michael called him into a private room and spoke softly, as if choosing a tone could steer destiny. "We have an important hearing," Michael said, thumb resting on a sheaf of papers. "You will be asked to read some documents. If you do this well, you will be with us in the next delegation. It will be good for you." Daniel's breath hitched. The hearing was set for a courthouse across town, public, with lawyers and cameras. He knew, without being told, that the words he would pronounce there could seal the deeds and make the eviction official in the eyes of a wider world. Walking home under the drizzle, Daniel felt the world closing like a book about to be shut. The choices ahead were not simple. To refuse might mean losing the small safety he had found. To accept might chain his voice to someone else's power. He began to practice in his head not only how to say the words, but how to say them so they did not become a knife. He had learned 9 languages to be heard. Now each language could be an instrument of harm. The rain fell steady as a clock, and Daniel understood with a cold, quiet clarity that the moment before him would define more than one life. The courthouse smelled of paper and bleach and a very thin film of fear. Morning light slanted through high windows and fell on rows of faces, some bored, some hungry for scandal, some simply tired. The judge's bench was a dark curve. The press cameras looked like beetles with glass eyes. Daniel felt the floor under his shoes as if it were the last piece of earth before a cliff. He had practiced the words 100 times, but practice is only a map, not the crossing. The empathetic voice remembered how small his hands had been when Grace taught him to fold shirts. It remembered the steady warmth of her palm on his brow when he woke with worry. The impartial voice measured the scene. A man summoned to read a document whose truth or falsehood could break people. Both voices lived in him, tugging in different directions. Anna sat in the 3rd row, her ring finger bare where the band had been, the skin behind her ear bright with the pressure of sleepless days. She had come early and carried a small case. Peter lounged near Michael, posture smooth as a cut of marble. Michael himself moved like someone who owned the light that hid his shoulders. His robe was folded with the same patient cruelty Daniel had begun to associate with him. John, the thin man from Mandarin, was there too, shoulders hunched, the photograph of a house clutched in his hand like a prayer. Beside him stood a woman in a simple dress, Aunt Mary, face older than the picture, but the same laugh visible in creases around her eyes. They had come for the valley, and for what Daniel's voice might be asked to do. The judge called the hearing to order. Lawyers shuffled paper. The prosecutor, Elijah, a man with a bone-deep seriousness, stood and asked the court for permission to sub in a recorded translation. Daniel's palms were damp. The thumb drive Anna had given him burned cold where it rested in his pocket. Mr. Grant requests the translation be read aloud by the witness, Michael's lawyer said, smooth as oil. The room bent forward. The plan had been small and dangerous. Anna, under the pretense of duties, had recorded Michael in private months before a conversation where he spoke candidly to a collaborator about methods, purchases, and cleansing deeds with translations that would be forged into truth. She had kept the recording hidden, waiting for the one time she could hand it to someone who would listen. That person was Daniel. Anna rose now and walked to the prosecutor. She placed the small case on the table and opened it with hands that trembled but did not break. Daniel felt the tremor in his own throat as if they were connected by a thread. Your Honor, Elijah began, we submit Exhibit A, an audio recording of a private conversation in which Mr. Michael Grant admits to manipulating registration documents and instructs staff to translate to fit, in language he understands as the path to legal acceptance. Gasps whispered through the room like wind through dry leaves. Michael's face did not move. The impartial voice noted, a recorded confession is evidence that cannot be easily erased. The empathetic voice felt the sudden, raw exposure as a living thing. Someone's life peeled like fruit. The playback began. At first it was low and grainy. Then Michael's voice came, velvet and cruel in the past. He spoke in a language Daniel understood only in part then, a native cadence that made his arrogance even more clear. Daniel closed his eyes and listened. Listened not to the sound, but to the meaning behind it. When the prosecutor signaled, Daniel stood and translated live, his voice tight but clear. Ensure the paper says what we need. If the counsel requires proof of lineage, produce it. If names must be slightly changed to match legal forms, adapt them. Language makes law believe, Daniel said in English, his words like drops of light falling into a dark room. Each translation struck like a tiny hammer. Michael's face went pale in stages. His mouth made a line that tried to be a smile but failed. Peter's eyes darted, and in that small glance the impartial voice read a calculation. He had not expected the recording. The empathetic voice saw the shame shiver across Michael, like ripples in oil. John stood when asked. His voice was thin at first, then steady as he told the court about the trucks that had come to the valley, the men in neat uniforms who had shown papers with stamps and signatures, the mothers who had wrapped their children and left. Aunt Mary spoke next, her hands folded around the photograph, and told the judge about the house by the stream, about letters that had stopped, about a name that had disappeared. The prosecutor then turned to Anna's other handoff, a folded ledger she had hidden, bound with a cheap strap, with pages of adamantine in their simplicity. Within its columns, in small, careful script, were entries, payments, shell company names, and a single line in a clerk's hand that matched a stamp used by Peter's private company. Elijah placed the ledger on the table and tapped the page. It appears, Elijah said quietly, that the holding company that legally acquired the deeds is registered under names linked to Mr. Peter Cullen's investments. We ask the court to consider the possibility of collusion between foundation officials and private interests. Silence fell like curtain. Peter's jaw worked. For the first time, he had no polished answer ready. The cameras angled, as if to catch the exact moment the man's composure flayed. Betrayal sat in the room like a third body. Peter's voice was small when he spoke, but the statement that followed was a knife. I am an investor. Yes. But Mr. Grant approved all operations. I acted under instruction and with authorization. The impartial voice noted, authorized or not, the ledger tied his name to the purchases. The empathetic voice felt the sharpness of a man who had smiled at Daniel and then learned to take from a valley, had been using trust as a harvesting tool. Michael's composure broke altogether. He rose like a man stripped of a coat. His hands trembled. You filmed me, he hissed at Anna, voice now thin and dangerous. You betray me? You promised. Anna's face hardened into something that was not only fear. She had been coerced, yes, but that fear had been joined now with a calm fury. I promised myself, she said, and her words cut through the room. She told the court how she had been forced to translate without question, how requests came with veiled threats, how she had watched families move away with the wrongness swelling in her chest. Betrayals layered. Anna's prior cooperation, Peter's private profits, Michael's public face that hid private plans. The judge listened like a man threading a needle. The emotional weight in the room shifted. Sympathy for the valley now had a face in Anna's tired eyes and John's weathered hands. Daniel stood at the center, his languages humming like chords underfoot. The empathetic voice wanted to weep at the families, at the way words had been sold. The impartial voice cataloged evidence and precedent. He felt both things at once. When the prosecutor played back one final clip, this one of a meeting in which Peter and Michael discussed allocating testimonies and reinforcing narratives with translations, Peter's defenses crumbled. He leaned forward and, with a voice like a man confessing to himself, admitted that he had invested in the property through intermediaries and had not told the foundation's board. You used me, Anna said to Michael, voice small and edged with years of pressure. You used my skill to burn someone else's home to ash on paper. I cannot live with that. Michael blinked once, as if the lights were suddenly too bright. He made no grand claims of innocence. His empire was not built on innocence, but on plausible deniability, which now washed away in the glare of recordings and ledgers. Outside, cameras whirred like insects. Inside, the human damage settled in the air, stories of lost houses, of children who had cried when their pots were packed, of a grandmother who could not find a name on a map. The judge called a recess, but the sound of court did not wait for gavel. It moved in the faces of those who had been betrayed. Daniel felt the change like the first cold on his hands when winter arrived. He had come to read a paper. He left with the knowledge that his voice, shaken and human, could cut open the machine that tried to buy silence. The cost had been high, trust broken, friends forced into impossible corners, lives exposed. But the truth now had a shape that could be seen and held. Anna met Daniel as people filed into the hallway. She looked exhausted, and when she reached for his hand, her grip was immediate and honest. I am sorry, she said, the apology like a bridge she had built across. Daniel saw in her face both the old betrayal and the fierce courage of a person who had finally chosen a different kind of loyalty. He thought of Grace waiting at home, of the jasmine scent of her presence, and of the men who had laughed as if the world were a private theater. The cameras might make headlines. The court might return to its slow, precise sentences. But for the moment, the light in the hall felt clearer. As they left, the empathetic voice whispered a tired prayer, that the families might find their land again, or a place to put the pictures back into their hands. The impartial voice reminded him that law moves slowly and that wounds do not heal at once. Both voices were true. Both stayed with him as he stepped into the thin winter sun and felt, for the first time in months, the steady weight of his own words in his mouth. The days after the hearing felt like a slow tide pulling hard at the shore. News vans came less often, but the court's decision carried weight that did not vanish with the cameras. Papers filed, lawyers argued, and the judge, patient and deliberate, moved toward a remedy that would have to live in law as well as in people's lives. The impartial voice would record the facts. Michael Grant faced charges for fraud and collusion. Peter Cullen was indicted for using front companies to buy property, and a government panel was ordered to review all registrations connected to the foundation. The ledger Anna produced was entered into evidence, and a recorded conversation could not be easily dismissed. The court ordered a temporary freeze on the disputed deeds and appointed an independent committee to investigate further. But the empathetic voice stayed with the small things that could not be written into the list of charges. John's hands, the way they trembled when he held the photograph of the house by the stream. Aunt Mary's laugh, smaller now, but still stubborn in her throat. The valley itself, whose green had been cut by trucks, and whose people had been forced to carry what little remained over dusty roads. Legal wins would not instantly fill the holes left in living rooms or return years taken from people's lives. Compensation was complicated. The law could order money and demand apologies, but it could not grow back a crop that had failed or stitch time for children who had slept under tarps. The committee found many questionable transfers, and some families received offers to return to their land under protections that had to be monitored for years. For others, there were payments and housing assistance. The judge, with a slow human grief in his voice, said this would take patience and oversight. The court asked for community input, for NGOs to help rebuild trust. Daniel watched the news with hands that no longer shook as much. He went to the meetings the committee held and listened like someone cataloging each bruise. He sat beside John as lawyers translated terms into language that made sense to people who had little trust left for legal phrases. He read aloud, gently, making the words clear and human. People thanked him, sometimes simply with a slow closing of palms to chest, the universal sign of relief. Anna's life did not return to how it had been. She testified fully and cooperated with investigators. In return, the prosecutors arranged a protective agreement. She left the foundation and took a position with a legal aid group that worked with displaced families. She wore a small, cautious smile when she walked into the offices of the aid group for the first time. Daniel thought of the way she had pressed her ring into his palm the day she first warned him. Guilt and redemption, he decided, can live on the same street, one after the other. Peter faced the law's teeth. He did what many men in his position do. He hired lawyers and argued misinterpretation. Yet the ledger entries, the shell company filings, and his private emails were heavy enough that the case did not vanish. He settled, in part, fined and barred from certain business activities. Michael, sharper and more insulated, fought longer, but the evidence made his options narrow. Arrest, trial, or exile were the paths before him. Power had teeth, and the law bit back. Grace watched the slow process with steady, private worry. The money from the foundation had been tempting. It could have solved small, immediate problems for them both. Daniel had been offered a position with an international cultural program, an easy path, well paid, with travel and soft rooms. He turned it down. He could not accept a job where his voice might again be used to smooth over wrongs. He told Grace in the kitchen, the radio on low and rain on the window, that he could not take riches if they came with a mark on someone's life. You did not choose the easy road, she said, her hands warm on the dishcloth. You chose the right one. Her words were not praise. They were a small contract between them. They moved together into a tiny apartment a few streets from the market. It was small enough that Grace's folding felt like an art again and large enough for a plant by the window. The rent was modest. The bills were steady. They ate simple meals and kept a jar of coins for emergencies. It was not wealth, but it was honest. It gave them space to breathe. The court's resolution included a community fund, seeded partly by funds recovered from the foundation's accounts and partly by public contributions. Daniel insisted that part of the fund should pay for legal clinics and language education. so people could defend their own records and speak within the systems that had once been used against them. He argued that language must be taught as armor as well as art. The judge agreed. At the first meeting in a sunlit community center, Daniel stood before a small circle of children and adults, a chalkboard behind him, and a stack of worn language books on the table. He felt his old fear and a new clarity beside it. He taught the children simple phrases, not only in French or Spanish, but in the language of rights. How to ask for a deed, how to say no to suspicious papers, how to demand an interpreter who will not be biased. The children laughed when he mangled new sounds, and his laughter made something inside him soft and strong at once. The impartial voice recorded that his choice to teach was an effective use of the fund. Projects were measured. Outcomes were tracked. The empathetic voice watched a small boy tuck a translated form into his pocket like treasure and thought, "This is how dignity grows, one sentence at a time." There was no neat closure. Some people could not return to their old fields. Some relationships remained brittle. Anna and Daniel did not pretend that all wounds were healed, but they had created a space where repair could begin, where language was not sold as a salve for commerce, but offered as a tool for truth. At night, Daniel would sit by the window, Grace beside him, and listen to the river move like a slow promise. He thought of the first note he had found, the whisper, "Speak 9 and you will not be ignored." He understood now that being heard does not always mean being free. Sometimes being heard means carrying responsibility. His languages were no longer a way to enter rooms where people laughed at him. They were a way to make sure that laughter could not buy silence. He kept the thumb drive Anna had given him. It was no longer just protection. It was a reminder. He had recorded, testified, and used his voice in a courtroom. He had seen what words could do when put to use with care, and what they could do when bent into tools of harm. He had learned that language both reflects power and can redistribute it. The last image hung in his mind like a painting. Him in a small classroom, sunlight cutting through dust motes, a child bending over a sheet to copy a phrase correctly, Grace at the door with a cup of tea and a tired, satisfied smile. Outside, the city continued its noisy work, deals made, lessons learned, and new chances created. The impartial voice would say the work ahead was long and slow. The empathetic voice would say the slow work was worth it. Daniel had found a way to hold his voice steady, to make it a shelter and not a sail. That choice, small and resolute, felt like a home. So, tell me, if you were in his shoes, mocked and underestimated, would you have revealed your success or walked away in silence? Drop your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that flip the script on arrogance.